après poser des questions en français aussi, je vais juste parler en anglais. Voilà. So according to the War Report of the Geneva Academy, in 2018 there were at least 69 armed conflicts taking place in the territory of 30 states. Of these, at least 51 were non-international armed conflicts or internal conflicts in 22 states. In these conflicts, there were more than 400 armed state actors or armed groups that were involved in the fighting. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the armed groups part here because that's my experience. So for the record, on the contrary to the previous two speakers, I am not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist. So I did study international law, but I still have a very political perspective of the world. But still my organization, in English is called Fight for Humanity. We are committed to the promotion of human rights and of international humanitarian law. So not just to promote the law in itself, but really as a tool for achieving an objective, and the objective is the respect for the right of people and the protection of people, particularly that conflict actors or armed actors should take measures to protect. When we work on this, sometimes we go out to the field and we decide to stay for several days with some armed non-state actors in order to be able to discuss with them, to provide in-depth humanitarian law training. And at least on one occasion, while laying in a camouflage tent in a rebel camp, me and my colleagues were realizing that in that very moment we were definitely legitimate collateral damage. So we tried not to think too much about that, but we kept on listening for helicopters and drones throughout the night. There are also much less dramatic examples. For example, when we've been sitting to discuss protection of civilians next to a swimming pool in a nice hotel in La Habana, but the topic is still the same. I think I've seen many synergies with the previous speakers. My answer might be a little bit different, but I think we're still quite in line. I will focus on four main aspects to contribute to the answer of the question. So the first one is the main qualities of international humanitarian law, the main challenges to international humanitarian law, some of the main challenges, some possible work to promote international humanitarian, specifically the Geneva Conventions that we're talking about today, and work also to protect the Geneva Conventions. So the main qualities, well, as you know, the Geneva Conventions were adopted 70 years ago, and it's still amongst the most universally accepted treaties. They remain, and here I agree with Jean-Marie, they remain widely supported among states, at least verbally. Also, many armed non-state actors are recognizing that is a valid framework. They make reference to it also in codes of conduct and other documents. So we see the Geneva Conventions as an incarnation of thousands of years of experience of humanity. They are evidence of our suffering, but also of our learning. So as also previously explained, we have been introducing new conventions to respond to identified needs, so it's still something that develops. So we know that measuring the impact of the Geneva Conventions is difficult. We have no doubt that they have helped to reduce the suffering of millions of people by promoting restraint, but also by allowing thousands of hardworking humanitarian professionals and volunteers, ICRC and other actors, the space and the legally protected space also to work to alleviate the situation in conflict-affected areas. We also believe that IHL can play a central role in limiting the atrocities and in this way facilitate for peace and reconciliation in the future. And there, of course, it would be interesting to see the study that ICRC is working on, the impact of IHL. So for this reason, we see the Geneva Conventions not only as a tool for protection, but they are also an expression of our common humanity and our standards. So it could be an idea that UNESCO could declare the Geneva Conventions as part of the world immaterial or intangible cultural heritage, because it's really something that we have developed. On some of the main challenges. So the question of today is, are they still being respected? The counter question would be, and I think this was referred to by Martin, were they ever respected? So to my mind, they are not being fully respected. And I think this is really the feedback you get when you talk to victims in the field, in conflict-affected areas, where really it's where the respect for humanitarian law and human rights will be the most needed. Again, these days that almost everyone has a smartphone with a camera, violations are more easily recorded, but that doesn't necessarily per se mean that there are more violations. As the Swedish public health expert Hans Rosling would say, There is no need to be nostalgic about the rosy past. Most likely the present is better than the past, and the future can still be better. For example, what was accepted or not really an issue yesterday will be barely tolerated today and unacceptable tomorrow. For example, the use of child soldiers. So I think still we are advancing. As I listened to the UN debate on the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions in August, it was interesting to hear that all the intervening states from the globe, including the P5, agreed on the importance of the Geneva Conventions, and everyone was stressing that the problem is not the conventions, the problem is the incomplete implementation and the lack of respect. Understanding, of course, the lack of respect by others. But as they say, you need to lead by example. So another point is that there are no universally functional mechanisms of accountability, including for the persecution of perpetrators, because this still remains highly political. We also think that a problem is that the Geneva Conventions are still largely unknown by civil society organizations across the globe, who mostly focus on human rights compliance by states. So if they don't know the rules, or even that there are rules of war, it's difficult for them to promote those. Also, the fact that Geneva Conventions are very technical and non-absolute probably doesn't help. I'm saying non-absolute, it means that it's talking about regulating and not prohibiting war. So it's talking about some things that are permitted under certain circumstances, depending on the principles of distinctions, proportionality, and precaution. And this allows for interpretations and loopholes. And for example, in some trainings I've been with civil society, when you are discussing specific examples with them, they would just say, no, attacks can never be allowed, or this cannot be allowed because we don't know this and that, and we cannot control the factors. So it's very difficult to understand. And even sometimes it could be the same when you discuss humanitarian law with armed groups, and then somehow you have to awkwardly explain that actually it's not necessarily unlawful to attack, but they can of course choose to do differently, but that military objectives can be attacked. There's also the issue of that Geneva Conventions don't always give the same obligations and rights to parties in non-international armed conflict, and this can sometimes be confusing, not very helpful when you're discussing with armed groups. They could sometimes ask, but why are our fighters, when they are detained, they are not prisoners of war? And why are we always just criminals, but we need to respect the law? So in this sense, if you're always called a terrorist, regardless of what you do, you may also end up behaving like one. So what can be done to promote the Geneva Conventions? This is still the more interesting part. I think there have been many ideas circulating here and also in the UN debate that I mentioned. There are many good ideas, but we also need to work to put them in practice. I think there are many ideas that link to the fight against impunity. Yes, this is very important, but how, when, where? As Fight for Humanity, we have been working to advance on the trial of ISIS members held in northeast Syria. We organized an academic debate on this with the Academy in May. Still now the circumstances have changed, but there were political considerations that made it difficult to progress on this issue, notably also because the ISIS members were held by another non-state actor, so not by a state actor. So now with the current fighting, we know that some of those who were detained have run away, some maybe are killed. So the idea of fighting impunity is good, but we need to be ready to act on it. There are, for example, they're setting up a mechanism such as the IIIM. It's an international impartial independent mechanism set up by the UN for Syria. This could, for example, be a good example, but we need more political willingness to advance. There are also arguments linked to how to increase the outreach to military and political actors, because of course if the fighters don't know about the rules, how can they respect them? So there has been proposals linked more to conducting humanitarian diplomacy, more advanced dissemination amongst all the actors. also about how to work really concretely to translate humanitarian law into military doctrine, into the rules of engagements, etc. How to work with states when they are participating in coalitions with other states or with non-state actors to make sure that they also ensure respect by their allies. There's also the issue, and I think Dr. Jamal is going to talk more about that, but the need of making sure that humanitarian actors have access to conflict areas. And here we see the risks appearing linked to counterterrorism measures that make humanitarian work difficult. There's also the idea of reaching out more to civilian actors, civil society and so forth, also so they can work to influence the armed actors. As Marco was mentioning, teaching humanitarian law, for example, but also earlier on introducing the topics in the school, working through national humanitarian law committees, working more to reach out to affected populations in general with accessible messages. There's also the ideas around showing good practices and examples as came up by the previous speakers. And indeed, as they say, no news is good news, but unfortunately good news are usually not news at all. So this is where we have a lot of work to do. I think there are some good examples. For sure, I also would recommend the ICRC study, The Roots of Restraint. And also the Academy has a project with Geneva Call on our non-state actors' practices of IHL and human rights norms. I think also in general to see more interaction between military and political actors with civil society to discuss what are good or promising practices. And also to consider not just sanctions in the military system, but also like reward system. So as one member of an armed group once told me, Anki, you know, the problem is that no one rewards you for an interrupted attack, only for the number of enemies killed and weapons collected, and for the military successes, but not for the aborted attacks. And I think that would be probably very similar in state military system, that restraint is not rewarded in the same way as military success. Finally, we also need stronger monitoring mechanisms, and I think here even informal monitoring mechanisms can help give results if we cannot have formal things. For example, in one case, there was a report from a big human rights organization that had just come out a few days before we were supposed to have a high-level workshop to raise support for an IHL for a humanitarian law training process with an armed actor. So we were like, okay, they are not going to come, but they all came at very high level, and they were very angry with the report, defending themselves. They were angry that they were being criticized, but after long discussions, the final outcome was that they were committed to a training process to train their people in humanitarian law, and then to develop an IHL compliant code of conduct. The only thing with this type of reports, we have to be careful that they should also document good things that are happening in the same context, and not only the abuses, not to be counterproductive. Just need to document and promote it, and not only the abuses, so in line with the previous speakers. So finally, what can be done to protect the Geneva Conventions? So these days we have seen a mobilization of millions of young people, really, to push for action against climate change. At the same time, there are violations being committed against the Geneva Conventions that are also producing millions of victims every year. And they are contributing to the radicalization of armed groups and preparing the ground for future conflicts. Still, it's not creating the same momentum. So shouldn't this also be the justification for a new global campaign? As I said, the Geneva Conventions are still largely unknown by civil society organizations across the globe, especially in affected countries, and it remains largely an elite issue. So this would need to change. A broader crowd would need to be mobilized. And I think, as also mentioned by Marco, citizens should not accept that their own rights or the rights of others are not being respected in their own countries or elsewhere. So for this, we all need to be more courageous, committed, as experts, activists, journalists, politicians, and fighters, to raise awareness of the need to protect humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and what they stand for. Because if you Google, for example, human rights activists, you find 98 million results. If you Google IHL activists, you find 148 results, and most of them are probably badly referenced. So I would like to wrap up with the best quote that I could find in relation to the status of the Geneva Conventions. So it's from the theme song of the Lego Movie 2. So if you know it, it means either you have young children or you are Lego fans. Everything is not awesome. Things can't be awesome all the time. It's an unrealistic expectation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make everything awesome in a less idealistic kind of way. We should maybe aim for not bad, because not bad, well, that would be real great. So, as an international campaign for awesomeness is probably not very clear, Fight for Humanity would like to propose to initiate an international campaign to protect the Geneva Conventions. Thank you.